Super happy that I get to be the last one and talking about Module 7. I think first I have to go through the slides that tell you the important things about this meeting today. All participants are muted. There will be time for questions and discussions at the end of the meeting. We may not get around to all the comments or questions, but you can leave additional comments in the comment box to be compiled after the session. The session will be recorded and the presentation will be shared on our website after the call. We will not record the discussion portion. So that's so people can ask questions openly. The purpose of the series is to review the critical concepts of each module for those of you that are first joining this one and share recent FDA updates, PSA resources, and tips for presenting remotely. Intended audiences are PSA trainers and lead trainers, but as always, we welcome everyone. As a disclaimer, attending these office hours or watching their recordings does not count as attendance at a PSA Train the Trainer or Grower Training course, nor will you earn a PSA or AFTO certificate of completion. The PSA Grower Training slides are copyrighted and may not be published electronically without express permission of Cornell University, nor sold in whole or part by a third party or company for profit. Okay, that's official. So by the time you get to Module 7, whether it's a day-long course or a split course, any presentation anomalies, let's say you go long or one of your colleagues goes long, usually ends up in the lap of whoever is delivering Module 7. So what that means is, even though there's usually 45 minutes on the schedule to deliver Module 7, I think most of us that have ever done a training have done Module 7 in a lot shorter of amount of time because somebody else has used the time throughout the day. And that may not be a bad thing, but I think it's something you have to be aware of if you're in charge of delivering Module 7, which means you have to know what you're going to say and where the important parts are, because you may have to go quickly over some of the slides to hit on the most important parts. So starting there. With the learning objectives, I always like to make my learning objectives come in individually. So we're going to talk about parts of a farm food safety plan. We're going to describe why one qualified person should be designated as a person responsible for farm food safety on every farm. This is an interesting one because it overlaps with a rule. So we're going to talk to you about, why that person's important, what qualifications they should have, but what's required in the rule. Conduct a risk assessment of the farm's practices and environment. Okay, in this part, we're gonna go over why you want to inspire people to action in this module, right? It's the last module. It's a reason to be excited. They've made it through most of the training. And now you want them to take a moment and think about, what did they learn? What are the things that really apply to their farm? And how do they start putting practices in place? So we're going to talk about that. Describe management steps and practices to reduce risks. Again, what did they learn? How are they going to put it into practice on their own farms? Key steps in developing a traceability system, including establishing lots and clean breaks. Probably the biggest thing here is we now have a draft traceability rule. And so you're going to want to learn that new information and include that new information, but also help them just think through, what is traceability? How do they do it on their farms? Where do clean breaks come into the discussion? So these are just a few things we're going to highlight today in this. And identify resources available to assist in developing a farm food safety plan. As we have found with some data on the evaluations, people will often say, I wish I had a template, or I wish I had a record-keeping sheet to use as a draft. These are all available. So part of it is conveying that information to people because they simply don't know the resources are there. All right. So probably one of the most important parts about this presentation, Module 7, is you want to make sure they understand that a farm food safety plan is not required in the rule, okay? And then that inevitably leads to the question of, why is there a module about this if it's not required by the rule? And the answer is, when we were developing this course, let me get rid of my phone since I don't know how to turn the stupid thing off. When we were developing this course, we did focus groups and listening sessions across the country. And one of the things that came up was the need to have a farm food safety plan. The growers felt the need. Why? Because they were being asked to have audits. They needed help writing them. So that is why it's included, even though a farm food safety plan is not required in the rule. It's also important to talk about the benefits of a farm food safety plan beyond just food safety, right? It's great for food safety because it helps them use their time and money efficiently, but it's also good for a lot of other attributes on the farm, right? Keeping your business organized, establishing a food safety culture, following quality. There's lots of reasons why a farm food safety plan is beneficial. So important to hit on that piece. So here we talk about reasons for a farm food safety plan. I just mentioned the policies, practices, keeping people organized, and of course for third-party audits and food safety regulations, again, not required, but easier to figure out what you're doing and get yourself organized if you have a plan. Always love, we talk about this in Module 1, we talk about it again in Module 2. It's important for growers to recognize that their commitment is important and they can learn to identify risks. Can they hire somebody to help them with this? Absolutely, right? But each farm is unique. So if they do hire a third party, that person is going to have to get to know the farm well in order to write an effective farm food safety plan, okay? And they do have to take into account all the commodities they grow and the differences in risk of those commodities. So it's just important to sort of hit that information. Who is your farm food safety person? Each farm should have, notice the shoulds here, should have one person to lead the development of a farm food safety plan. They'll of course be supported by other people and they may need a backup, but you want to have that one person. They should have food safety training experience. Why? Because they're developing a food safety plan for your farm. Here's ones that growers don't always think about. They need to have the authority to make necessary changes and invest in resources to reduce risks. You can give somebody on your farm, a secretary, an intern, the ability to develop the plan. But if that person cannot tell other people what to do, buy the resources that are necessary, and affect change, they're probably not the right person to lead it. They need to make sure the plan is implemented, which requires all those things, and they need to be willing to be the food safety contact. That means when an auditor comes or an inspector comes, they have to have the confidence to interact with those people. And I circle it here in the corner because this is the first time you're seeing a regulation. And the reason for that is because the rule does require a farm to name the person who's essentially in charge of making sure the practices are implemented, right? So the farm has to identify somebody who's in charge of making the implementation of practices happen. So it is a regulatory requirement. And that's why all of these things are important, right? I framed this as a question, but this is why you should spend time here as a trainer on this slide in particular, is making sure people know what is required of that farm food safety person, right? The rule doesn't outline all these characteristics, but it's important to let them know why those characteristics are important, all right? This is an optional slide. I color my optional slides orange in the title. Talking about why knowledge is important, right? You've got to have basic food safety knowledge in order to assess risks and come up with a plan. Again, it doesn't mean you can't use outside resources, you can't ask for help. It just means the person who's in charge really does need to have the knowledge to do it. Is it fair necessarily? Maybe not, that a farmer is required to become enough of a food safety expert to develop a plan for his farm, but that's the way it's currently written. Talking about the farm food safety parts, these are all important, but what I want to highlight about this slide is that some of these things are easy and some of them help the grower get through the writer's block that sometimes comes when they're developing a plan. Farm name and address, pretty clear. Farm description. Most growers know how long they've been on the farm, what they've been growing. That's easy information for them to write down, which helps them get started on the plan. Contact information for a farm food safety manager, that's the slide we just talked about. And then this is where assessing risks of practices, environmental conditions that impact food safety, this is where they're going to use the information they learned in this training. What are the practices that reduce the risks? And I did color the records that document practices red because there are requirements in the rule that they have certain records, right? And so that leads to the next slide, where you can talk about these are items that are important. Again, you need training records, you need ag test results, you need the inspection of your water distribution system. But all of these things are important to have in your farm food safety plan. Okay, we start back to the beginning, like the flow of all these modules. Step one, assessing your risks and reviewing those farm practices, looking at their farm as a whole. Who's adjacent to me? What do I have going on my own farm? Do I have animals? What are the things? Do I use biological soil amendments of animal origin? Do I have wildlife problems? What are my microbial primarily and then chemical and physical risks? And helping them identify the ones that are most likely to occur. Now, this to me is a great time. You don't have to do it here. You can do it wherever you want to do it, but you really need to inspire them to action. And I mentioned this earlier, the growers have been in the class all day or maybe over multiple days since it's now remote and we tend to break it up over 2 days. You need to get them thinking about what did they learn? What are the 3 things, 5 things, 10 things, however you want to do it, that they think introduce risks on their farms, right? They've had all day. You've been through all the modules. What are the things that are jumping out at them? Take a moment and ask them that. They can share it. They can write it down on a piece of paper and start putting together practices as you go through the next steps. But you really want to put them in a place at the end of the day to make an action when they go home, right? It's the last module. You want to celebrate what they've learned and start putting that into action. This will help them do ranking of risks, right? If they list a bunch of stuff, that will help them start thinking which of these is most important. They're not going to go home and do 100 things, right? It's not going to happen that way. You want them to have a list and start working through the list. So try and help them rank the ones that are most important. Think through how you rank using a slide like this, and then keep them moving forward. Talking about developing practices that reduce risks, right? In each of the modules, starts with risk assessment, talks about practices to reduce risks, right? Talks about monitoring, corrective actions, and then we get to document and revise. So when you're talking about a farm food safety plan, one of the key things is to let them know it's a document that will change by the nature of it, right? You want them to start writing the plan. And starting writing the plan does not automatically mean they're going to finish it in one day, right? So it's going to be a plan that changes as they implement things and learn what works and what doesn't work. They need to be told you can change the things that don't work, right? Just because it's written down doesn't mean you can't make updates. And you don't necessarily have to rewrite the whole plan. You can make a date change, put a line through something, and add something new, right? You want to build that record keeping into a logical flow, because otherwise it ain't going to happen. But the key thing there is getting them to know, start it, knowing that you can evolve it as you learn. Very important piece. So which of the following records, this is for everybody to use, annotate if you've done this before. This is one of our clicker questions that is available for trainers to use. Which of the following records is not required by the FSMA PSR, but still would be useful in a farm food safety plan? If you guys are not familiar with your annotate button, it's, let's see where it's at on my screen. It's in your bar, usually at the top, and it's under annotate. It's got a little pencil. So those of you who are participating, if you could answer the question, there we go. Okay, a smart group here. That is correct. Actions taken to minimize wildlife intrusion into the fields is the correct answer. And thank you all for using Annotate. All of these other ones, the inspection of the water system, cleaning and sanitizing of harvest totes and equipment, and worker training dates, topics covered, and who was trained are all requirements in the rule. This is an optional slide, educational resources. I did mention this at the beginning. There are tons of them from a lot of places. And certainly the National GAPs program has a bunch through the Decision Tree Project that we did with Minnesota and Tennessee. But lots of industry and commodity groups have guidance, trade associations, there's federal guidance. And these materials are provided in the training materials. There's a list of them right in the manual. So that might be a good time to take a moment, go back to the manual and highlight those things. Farm Food Safety Plan writing resources. The purple is what you want to pay attention to in this slide. You need to remind them that it's great to use a template, but they have to make it their own. There's lots of stories of people going to a farm that grows tomatoes and their manual says cantaloupe, right? So the deal is you want to make sure that they update it, put their own farm name on it, put their own commodities in there, and that they make it their own. That's the key part to this slide. A few thoughts about your plan. Again, this one is a build of that. First of all, you want to make it your own, right? So if you get a template, you want to make it your own. The next thing is making sure you're putting things in there that you do. Don't include things you wish you were doing, okay? There's a lot of growers that want to write, this is where I'm headed, but you got to keep the plan to what you're doing. It's okay to leave notes that where you're headed, but you got to have the plan for what you are doing, because if an auditor comes on the farm and the auditor looks at your plan, which they will because it's an audit, not an inspection, they're going to look at the plan and want to know you're following the plan. So that's why it's important. Doesn't need to be long or complicated. Again, picking practices and schedules you could do with a focus on risk reduction. So you have the farm, you've started writing your farm food safety plan, you got your records are being kept, you're moving in the right direction, and this is where we're going to talk about traceability. Again, in the PSR itself, there's some labeling requirements, no real focus on traceability, but now we have a draft traceability rule out there. So that's the important change here. I think this is critical. If growers, so let's say we have a lot of growers that take this course that are not subject to the rule, and we do, we have that data. There are lots of reasons why traceability is valuable beyond food safety. Following quality. We have examples of growers sending boxes to a buyer and the buyer saying, this box was no good, and the grower saying, give me the code, and it turns out it was a box that got lost in the refrigerator or the cooler. Keeps track of the amount sold. If you work with small farmers who do a lot of farm markets who have never kept track of what they should be making, they're always a little surprised at that information once they have it. It tells them what sells better at what market. It tells them how much money they should have. That's a good reason. And then it does minimize foodborne illness impacts, right? You know how much is out in the marketplace. You know how much you need to get back. You can quickly limit illness spread if it is your stuff that caused a problem. So there's a lot of reasons for traceability, and it's good to spend time on this slide. Explaining what traceability is, one step forward, one step back. The state of New York is doing a blue ribbon panel on traceability, and this came up in that some farmers aren't even doing this yet. They don't really know how to establish one step forward and one step back. So if they really haven't thought about it and don't understand the concept, here's a good place to spend some time. Bullet 3 to me is really, really important, because if they haven't thought about it, they often think they have to trace it all the way to the consumer, right? And they think like, well, once I sell it to a buyer, how do I know what happens to it? And so you need to encourage them that, no, you don't have to trace it all the way to the consumer. You just got to know, where did it come from in your farm and where did you sell it? Now, let's say you direct market, and so you sell it direct to the consumer. Do I need to write down every consumer? No, you just need to know what you took to what market, on what day and what you sold, right? So get that one step back, and that market is that one step forward. Understanding a lot. This is difficult and it's different for every farm. What they need to do is they need to decide, how am I going to establish a lot for my farm? For smaller farms, it may be everything harvested on one day. For larger farms, it's probably going to be a portion of the day's harvest. Maybe they're going to do it by variety or by commodity. There's a ton of different ways you can set it up. As a trainer, I think it's good to have a few ideas in your head to give as examples. I think it's good to have an idea for a small farm, an idea for a big farm, and give them the differences. This discussion of a clean break, what does that mean? Well, let's say you have tomatoes and you have a cantaloupe and they go across the same line. If you don't have a clean break, if you don't clean the equipment to say, okay, the tomatoes went first, now the cantaloupe are going, they essentially become the same lot because there's no break in their touching of this food contact surface that could have led to a contamination, right? So you want to make sure it's cleaned and sanitized between commodities going across those common food contact surfaces. There's a great publication we reference from University of Florida in there. You can read up on that and share that with the growers if they have questions. Developing a lot code also can be done any number of ways, can use numbers, letters, combination of both. I always remember Wes Klein talking about developing lot codes and then putting them on the product using a old grocery store gun, right? That gives those little tags so that you know on the box, how do you get the lot code to the box, right? So you have to think about developing the lot code, but then you have to think about, how am I going to get that lot code on my containers? You can see plastic container here, which are often really hard to tag. You can see the tag here in orange. So the things you need to consider: what field are my fields numbered? How do I make that lot unique? Again, going to vary by size of the farm. Very important to think about that. And so the next few slides talk about, how do you start to think about that, right? If you're going to develop it by field location and you've got a big field, a big farm, how do you start naming those fields, numbering those fields? Sometimes for apple farmers, it's easy because they have blocks. The blocks are usually by variety, right? So that is a little easier. For smaller farms where you have really teeny production, maybe it's easy because you do it by commodity, or maybe it's just field one and everything comes out of field one, right? Because you don't have that difference. Packing crews. Do you have one crew that harvests and packs, or do you have crews that only harvest or only pack, right? Those are going to be things you need to contend with and figure out how you're going to answer those questions on each individual farm. This example walks you through the commodity including type. We use the example here, we're in New York, Empire apples, right? If you were a grower and you had multiple blocks with multiple different varieties, that's an easy way to do it. Farm field block of origin, the inputs applied, you want to be able to connect this number to your sprays, to everything that went on to that crop, including irrigation water, water test. The harvest date, the harvest crew, the packing house. A lot of people field pack, so the packing house becomes not as important. But these are things you need to pay attention to and walk them thinking through that. Here's an example. Again, you can see here it's optional with the lot code that they put on. So there's the farm location. It's the Rose Farm, so that's different. Block 1, apples, Empire, and the harvest date, they use a Julian date. Why do they use a Julian date? Many people will use a Julian date because they don't want people to know the date things were harvested, because they want people thinking it was just harvested yesterday, or they don't want to know there was a delay. You can see on this label, they have October 11, 2011 actually written on the label too. So the Julian date is sort of an internal thing. The thing that's not on here though is the name of the farm, right? The name and address of the farm, which is important for traceability in the sense of once it's out there, people need to know what farm it actually came from. So what's the name of the farm? What's the address of the farm? And this comes to talking about labeling, right? Each container or lot leaving the farm should be identifiable. So you can have the best lot code ever, but if it doesn't go on the container, there's no way to tell, where it came from. The other thing that came up in the discussion the other day was many commodities in the US are sold by the singlet, right? So the big box could have the lot code on it, but as soon as it's unpacked at retail, it gets separated from the lot code. So that is one of the challenges within the industry. But again, doing what you can at this point to label the box that goes to the person who bought it is important. And again, sticker stamps, barcodes, it can be high-end printed, it can be that little sticker gun I talked about. It really varies by the farm and by the size of the farm, right? Electronic or paper, both are acceptable. Labeling requirements, even for people who are qualified exempt, right? You have to prominently and conspicuously display at the point of purchase the name and complete business address of the farm where the produce was grown on a label, poster, sign, or placard, right? So it's pretty easy. You can make a sign that has your farm name, has the address of the farm, and make sure that is displayed, okay? So there are labeling requirements you can see here in the corner for these small farms, all right? Test your traceability system, conduct a mock recall. I personally am moving away from calling it a mock recall. I now just call it testing your traceability system because mock recall, I always worry the growers will call a store and say recall, or that's what the store will hear. But you do want to test the system, right? You want to make sure that it works, and you want growers to take the time to do it. So select a lot code that's been sold, call the buyer, and tell them that you're testing your traceability system or that you're conducting a mock recall. You want to ask them how much product they have in stock. You want them to give you the numbers that are on the box to see if you can trace it through their records. Does it line up with the spray records? Does it line up with your irrigation records? Does it line up with the application of soil amendments? Does it line up with the crew you had working that day, right? That's what you want to do. If growers do this and it works, great. If it doesn't work, figure out the problem. Either way, they want to document it, right? To see that they have figured out how this system works. So, in summary, when you go through the summary with the growers, I think it's important to go through these and ask the growers questions as you go. Okay, in summary, the best person to write the plan is someone who knows the farm and has food safety knowledge. Pause and ask them, why is that important, right? Get some feedback from the growers. Keep in mind, you're the last presentation. This is the last thing they're going to have in their head when they leave the meeting. So it's a good time to start wrapping up not only Module 7, but starting to wrap up the actual training, right? And you want them to go out the door inspired and pointed in the right direction. So get them to provide you some feedback here. Identify someone to be in charge of food safety, right? Again, why is that important? What should that person look like, right? Not look like, not what they look like. What should they know, right? Doesn't matter what they look like. Farm food safety plans should include assessing risks, any actions taken to reduce risks, and record keeping. So what's the question we ask the growers here? It's easy to ask them. Who wants to volunteer one of the things on your list, right? What's one of the things you're going to work on? Why is it a risk, right? If it has to do with worker training, you would expect them to say, because people can shed human pathogens that they can spread to produce they harvest. Okay, what are you going to do about that? Okay, in the past, I haven't been training in a language they understand, or I haven't been hanging up posters that are in a language they understand. Or maybe I've only been training the workers that touch covered produce and touch food contact surfaces. And I now know that training everybody in the farm is important because I want to build food safety culture. So you never know what you're going to get, but it's a good time to pause and ask them for that information. Simple as best. Write what you do, not what you hope you do. There's almost always in every training somebody who's got a story if they want to share that. Talking about traceability, one step forward, one step back. I would ask here if there's any questions. Is that clear to everyone? Is it clear what that expectation is? Because again, it seems like not everyone is understanding this requirement. Talking about lot codes, asking if there's any remaining question about that you can help them work through, pointing them to other trainings that might be available. I know lots of people have second days to their trainings where they write a farm food safety plan. So if you're doing that, you might want to encourage them to attend if they have questions. And then finally, follow the plan and update it as necessary. Again, very important for growers to understand that that plan is a document that is going to change as they learn and as they put more and more practices into place. So thank you for your attention.